Dude, I think the World Conference can convene, solving all of today's problems by talking excessively, no matter how hard it seems.
Globalization just means international integration. Okay, everybody's in favor of it. I mean, it's been the core principle of the left and the working class movement since their origins. That's why every union is called an international. Okay, everybody's in favor of globalization. Now, the term has been appropriated by a narrow sector of power and privilege to refer to their version of international integration, the investor rights version. And that makes sense for them to try to to own the term, because anyone who's opposed to their version then becomes anti-globalization, meaning some kind of primitive who wants to go back to the Stone Age or something like that.
We'll identify a country, usually a developing country, that has resources we covet, our corporations covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. Now, most everybody in our country believes that that loan is going to help poor people. It isn't. Most of the money never goes to the country. In fact, it goes to our own corporations. It goes to the Bechtels and the Halliburtons and the ones we all hear about, usually led by engineering firms, but a lot of other companies are brought in. And they make fortunes off building big infrastructure projects in that country. Power plants, industrial parks, ports, those types of things. The country's left holding this huge debt that it can't possibly repay. So at some point,
Genre is that it's all about human frailty. I mean, Alan Greenspan took refuge in the fact it's human nature, he said, and you can't do anything about that. But there's a whole world of explanations that kind of say it's the predatory instincts, it's the instincts for mastery, it's the delusions of investors and the greed and all the rest of it. So there's a whole range of discussion of that. And of course, the more we learn about the daily practices on Wall Street, we kind of figure there's a great deal of truth in all of that. The second genre is that there's institutional failures. The regulators were asleep at the switch. The shadow banking system innovated outside of their purview, etc., 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 and therefore institutions have to be reconfigured, and it has to be a global effort by the G20, something of that kind. So we look at the institutional level and say that has failed and that has to be reconfigured. The third genre is to say everybody was obsessed with a false theory. They read too much Hayek and believed in the efficiency of markets, and it's time we actually got back to something like Keynes, or we took seriously Hyman Minsky's theory about the inherent instability of financial activities. The next genre is that it has cultural origins. Now, we don't hear that much in the United States, but if you were in Germany and France, many people there would kind of say this is an Anglo-Saxon disease. And it's nothing to do with us. I happened to be in Brazil when it was going on, and Lula was kind of saying, well, first off he was saying, oh, thank God the United States is being disciplined by the equivalent of the IMF. We've been through it 8 times in the last 25 years, and now it's their turn. Fantastic, said Lula, and all the Latin Americans I knew, until it hit them, which it does. And then they kind of changed their tune a little bit. So there's a kind of a way in which it became cultural. And you can see that by the way in which this whole Greek thing is being handled. The way the German press is saying, well, it's the Greek character, it's defects in the Greek character. And there's a lot of rather nasty stuff going on around that. But actually there are some cultural features which have led into it. For instance, the US fascination with home ownership, which is supposedly a deep cultural value. So 67, 68% of US households are homeowners. It's only 22% in Switzerland. Of course, it's a cultural value in the United States that's been supported by the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is a huge subsidy. It's been promoted since the 1930s. Very explicitly in the 1930s, it was built up because the theory was that debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. And then there's a kind of notion that there's a failure of policy and that policy has actually intervened. And there's a funny kind of alliance emerging between the Glenn Beck wing of Fox News and the World Bank, both of whom say the problem is too much regulation of the wrong sort.
So the world today, as symbolized by our international felt melange, experiences widespread global economic interdependence. The scale of this trade has increased dramatically. 1. Multinational corporations have global reach and increasing power. 2. Travel and shipping are cheap and safe. It took about 2 months to cross the Atlantic in 1800. Today, it takes about 5 hours by plane and less than a week by ship. 3. Governments have decreased tariffs and regulations on international trade, leading to what is sometimes called, euphemistically, free trade.
The core of free trade, according to Adam Smith, is what he called free circulation of labor, meaning people can go wherever they want. But the fact, just in terms of movement of people across borders, is that it was higher then than it is now. I mean, that's why my parents didn't end up in a gas chamber, okay, because there was a lot of globalization in the sense of movement across borders. That's declined. On the other hand, by other measures, globalization has increased very fast, like movement of capital. So increase of capital flow across borders has just escalated astronomically in the last 25 years. So by that measure, freedom of movement of, say, speculation against currencies, that kind of thing, capital flow across foreign exchange movement, that's just escalated enormously. So by that measure, there's more globalization. You measure by people, less globalization. By capital movement, more globalization.
Yes, well, the oldest idea, the effects of globalization on labor conditions, really goes back to international trade theory, where in very brief form, the idea is that free trade leads resources to move towards their most productive uses. And when they're in their most productive uses, they have the maximum scope for monetary and non-monetary compensation. So the idea is the kinds of adjustments that go with free trade, while painful in the short run, lead to improved labor conditions in the long run. Globalization sets off a kind of race to the bottom, and the assertion involved in most race to the bottom arguments is that as countries compete to improve the scale of their exports and to attract foreign direct investment, they will degrade their labor conditions. You find improvements in all measures of labor conditions, both working conditions and labor rights. Secondly, when you look at the data, you find that the improvements were greatest in countries that were open to free trade, and the levels and rate of improvement in conditions were poorest in countries that were closest to international trade, closed to international trade. The effect of economic growth is quite noticeable. Basically, all measures of working conditions and labor rights improve when countries grow.
There are reasons to ask whether the process of widening human empathy has stalled, and at just the time when we need it to accelerate. After 4 decades of post-war progress, levels of inequality have risen in the rich world. Tensions between different ethnic groups persist and have taken on new dimensions. Anti-immigrant sentiment has grown, arguably reflecting a failure by policymakers to balance the imperatives of globalization and the ideal of universalism with the empathic capacity of the communities most affected by change. From gangs to the impact of violent video games, there are worries about young people. Globalization and public deficits may mean that future generations in the West face tougher challenges than their parents.
In the West, globalization has also led to the rise of a service economy. In the US and Europe, most people now work not in agriculture or manufacturing, but in some kind of service sector. Healthcare, retail, education, entertainment, information technology, internet videos about world history, etc. And that switch has really changed our psychology, especially the psychology of upper classes living in the industrialized world. I mean, to quote Frederick Jameson, we are so far removed from the realities of production and work that we inhabit a dream world of artificial stimuli and televised experience. Think of it this way. If you had to kill a chicken every time you visited KFC, you would probably eat fewer chickens. Another change of psychology? Many historians of the now note that globalization has also led to a celebration of individualism, particularly in the wake of the failures of the Marxist collectivist utopias. The generation that lived through the Depression